Yes, I know. You're majestic. Absolutely majestic. And I cherish you. Anyway, go away. So let's talk about Kate Chopin. Now, again, I know I don't necessarily need to go into the specifics of why we're online. We all know. We're all very, very aware of what's going on around us and how uncertain everything is. So let's just kind of jump in and see if we can continue with at least some illusion of normalcy and, try to ignore the maddening cackles from out in the hallway from my associates who are, desperately trying to forget the fact that the world is ending. And someone's banging on the wall. Anyway, so we have thoroughly moved out of the era of, oh, for God's sake, guys, I'm doing a live stream. You guys just made me do a live video, and then I hear Robert banging on the wall, and I'm like, for God's sake, I shouldn't have stopped it, because now I've got this video where I just freak out. Ugh. How many? Huh? I was doing Fleetwood Mac. Yeah, I'm sure you were. Right. Now I've got to start this whole thing over again. Luckily, I was only 30 seconds into it. So I'm going to have to start putting up signs.
I like your room.
I know, me too. I even like the dank.
Where'd the dragon come from?
Oh, he's been up there near the Millennium Falcon. I was actually using him in my discussion of Kate Chopin. I wasn't using him. He keeps interrupting.
Oh.
Yeah. Wait, is it still recording? Oh my God, it's still recording. You know what? I'm just gonna soldier on. Let's do this. What do you think? Should we continue the lecture? Anyway, okay. Back to Chopin. Damn it. I said a bad word. Anyway, we have exited out of the Romantic period, a period marred with fantasy and reconciliation to our natural and emotional selves, where we ignore the trappings of rationalism and the demands of the Enlightenment. And now we come back to an era that is, in many ways, a return to more sensible views of the world, but also with a different flavor. We are now in the middle of naturalism and realism. Now, last week, we talked a little bit about the story Daisy Miller. I gave you Henry James' Daisy Miller to punish you because I was angry at you. That story is an absolute nightmare to read, as is all Henry James. And keep in mind, when I say this, I actually kind of like Henry James. I don't know why, but I do. As you're reading Henry James, you probably noticed that there was no grandstanding moralizing. There was no fantastical elements a la Poe, or gosh, even Melville had a lot of like weird Twilight Zone moments, right? A lot of the romantics had those. Hawthorne certainly had them. At least the anti-transcendentalists did. And I'm using a lot of big words here. You guys, if you were in my American Lit class, well, if you weren't, why on earth are you watching a YouTube video lecture of American Lit? But the anti-transcendentalists had those kind of weird Twilight Zone moments I talk about a lot, where it's like reality falls away. That doesn't necessarily happen when it comes to realism. The thing about realism and the thing about naturalism is there was a sudden interest in depicting the world as it was, not an idealized world. And this is kind of interesting because it harkens back to something that Aristotle said, or it might have been Plato. I always get those two mixed up. In the book Poetics from Ancient Greece, there was an idea that art and literature should mimic ideal forms. We're not doing that anymore. Naturalism, realism brought us a hunger for a depiction of the world in all its realistic facets, warts and all. Now, a lot of the times what this gives us is a look at the world that is not dressed up for our sensibilities. And Henry James does this. In his books, conflict is extremely muted. It's all writing about parties and crumpets and social gatherings and box socials and, oh my goodness, what did Catherine say yesterday? Stuff like that, right? It's all just these weird social conflicts. And if you remember in Daisy Miller, there was the mismatch between the culture of the European aristocrat versus the new culture of the American nouveau riche, the new rich, that were not respected in that environment. But the whole story plays out in parties, constantly being served tea and weird gossiping and constant fretting over the identity of a fallen woman, right? And what's that lady Daisy Miller doing now, getting herself into all sorts of trouble, right? Luckily, we at least have a death to keep things interesting, but that's going to be par for the course for a lot of American realism. We are all of a sudden hanging out in the halls of the social elites. We are having tea and crumpets. We are having these conversations where so many things are said, but what is not said is just as important. For the modern reader, this is hellish. Because, again, we are used to stories revolving around lots and lots of action to move the plot along. Now, it's funny because even when we go to the high school and we think about like how we're taught about literature and how we're taught about storytelling in high school, you always see this graph where it's like the introductory elements, the exposition, rising action, climax, the resolution, and the denouement, right? We think of it in terms, all of it is arranged around that action. And essentially, Daisy Miller gives us so much rise, but the actual conflict comes when Daisy simply dates someone else. What was his name? Giovanelli. And she ends up getting yellow fever, I think, and dying. So really nothing happens in that story. It's all social weirdness. Now, we kind of set our high school students up for a bit of a shock when they start reading literature that is as substantial as naturalism and realism. It is an extremely unpleasant experience because we're just supposed to step into this extremely thick world of social drama and not expect a giant robot to come and kill everyone, right? Now, I know I'm exaggerating a bit here, but even someone who appreciates literature like me finds this stuff incredibly boring. You have to tough it out in order to get to the good stuff at the end. Now, it's a little different when we start talking about Kate Chopin, because Chopin takes this in a very interesting other direction. And she also gives us some different facets of realism that can actually make it a little bit more entertaining. First and foremost, we read At the Cajun Ball, and we read The Storm. These are quite possibly some of the most readable pieces of naturalism and realism that I could pick out. Like, this is extremely accessible stuff, mainly because we cover your ears, Scorch. I used to have this beautiful white dragon named Magic, and my dog got a hold of it, and I was like, Magic, no! I know, terrifying, right? But there's actual sex, right? We actually have a sex scene, and it's like, oh my goodness, people in literature, they express their love for each other, right? Like, I mean, in all the darkness and all the horror of the anti-transcendentalist era, when people are talking about how awful the human race is and all of this, just this despair, no one ever seemed to bump uglies. Like, I hate to be that vulgar, but it's weird that it took us this long to get there. Even Edgar Allan Poe, he's much, much more comfortable bludgeoning people to death with an axe than he is to show a woman's ankle. All right, like that's a bit of the Victorian era coming out. So we come to Chopin, and we have these two stories, and we actually get a sex scene, y'all. Like, this is Guiding Light era, like sensuality. I just realized I don't think any of my students are going to understand that reference. Like, how long has it been since Guiding Light went off the air? Like, ugh, geez, Guiding Light, man, that brings back memories. I'm getting very off the beaten track, but soap opera levels of passion, right? It doesn't go into any explicit detail. We just kind of have a passionate embrace that's kind of like, those old dime store romance novels you get at the drugstore. But the fact that it's there and the fact that it's addressed very, very openly is huge. So that is an element of realism. Realism wants to see things as they are, not as the way that we dress them up. It is kind of a reaction against the Victorian era sensibility that, we're not going to wither and die just because we see the world as it is. People who are privileged and people who are living up on the ivory tower, they need that experience as well. They were actually kind of hungry for it, right? You started to see all these depictions of people, not just these kind of passionate encounters, but you also start to see a lot of literature written about the poor, which is really interesting because, again, if you think back, we didn't really get many looks into the destitute. Even back to Sleepy Hollow, that was a small New England town. But you get the sense that everyone who's depicted in that story is at least a person of means, right? Brom Bones, he's not exactly living in squalor, right? He's someone who's respectable. This is when we first start actually getting looks at poor people, and it's like the vapors, right? But back to Chopin again. I'm meandering. Forgive me. Everything is, help me. I'm getting like email alerts right now, so if I get distracted, please excuse me. But another thing that Chopin gives us in these two short stories is a depiction of actual dialect. Naturalists get absolutely insane with dialect. Again, it's because they're desperate to show dialogue as it actually occurs, right? So there's a lot of accents. There's a lot of maybe not even grammatically correct things as they're trying to depict conversations in their natural state. Now, of course, this story gives us a setting that's extremely good for this, and the fact that it's a Cajun dialect, that's a very, very distinct accent that Chopin's writing in. For a lot of people who first are wading into naturalism, it can be very off-putting because it can be difficult just to follow the writing in that instance. My suggestion is to read it out loud. It'll be kind of irritating, but it will at least help you follow along in the more thick sections where so much of the writing can be a little inaccessible. So this is also what I like to call, and again, I'm speaking off the cuff here because as a literature teacher, I often kind of interpret things that might go against the grain for what people would, what experts would say. They might disagree with some of my assessment, but for me, naturalism and realism is the beginning of the real social justice kind of view of literature. It's at this point that literature starts to get extremely activist. And writers see social problems all over the place, and they start dragging it into the forefront of their writing. All of a sudden, feminism starts to come to the surface. The problems that women face begin to get a much bigger spotlight. The problems of the poor, the realities of war. I don't assign this. I should. I like to do modern novels when we read novels. Red Badge of Courage gives us a very realistic view of the front lines in the Civil War, where our main character is not an exemplary brave person. He has a moment of cowardice that he has to overcome. Again, it's actually really, really cool when you think about what's going on in that novel. The fact is that we see someone who is not absolutely perfect and not, has the opportunity to actually show a bit of cowardice and a bit of fear before they grow into the role that they're meant to play. That's a very realistic, very naturalistic thing to depict. And Stephen Crane is an absolute pain in the butt to read, but he was really, 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 good for his time. He was one of the premier figures of the realism and naturalism movement. Now, I want to give you guys a discussion question, but let me give you one last interesting note about these two stories as you read them. In The Storm, a lot of literature that would have been what I call activist at this point, where the issues of women are explored and discussed. If a woman did what Calixta does in The Storm, and it's also kind of odd that this is one of the first instances where we have a short story that was published and then is immediately followed up with a sequel. At the Cajun Ball has a sequel that is The Storm, where Calista marries Bobino. She has an affair, or at least a tryst, a romantic tryst with someone other than her husband, someone that she is in love with but did not choose to marry because it wasn't as economically feasible. Chopin depicts this tryst in a way that does not condemn Calixta, almost as if this is something that has to happen, something that is almost expected of a woman who's married to someone for economic security, but needs someone else to fulfill her physically. Up until this point, if a woman did what Calixta does in a story, she would have died. She would had to have died because she would be a fallen woman, and everyone kind of followed this weird moral logic, this moral thinking that if you depict someone doing something that bad, you have to kill them. They have to be shown as being punished for what they've done. Let that marinate in your mind a bit. The fact that we have a woman who simply gives in to her passion for someone other than her husband, and the fact that she is not outright condemned for that is quite revolutionary for this time, and would have had all the ladies in the parlors in their fancy dresses and their really long stockings covering up their ankles being like, oh my goodness, I've got the vapors. I know, right? I mean, that is sultry. That is scandalous. This is a huge jump. And it's one that I think is extremely entertaining. It's really sad, though, because in this class, in this textbook, we don't get Chopin's masterpiece, and that's The Awakening. The Awakening is more of a novella, and that novella is honestly one of my favorite things ever written. It is so damn good. That novel, that novella, The Awakening, is an absolutely perfect depiction of the kind of weird crossroad where we are in a realistic, naturalistic environment, and yet we're dealing with social mores. The whole thing like kind of plays out over tea and crumpets, but the difference between The Awakening and these short stories is that the main character is punished for her infidelity and for her lack of loyalty to her husband and to her family. It was absolutely, catastrophic in its time, the challenges that it brought forth. Now, I've outlined these stories for you, and I think, a fun place to go after this would be, let's throw a curveball. Let's do the yellow wallpaper. What a story to follow off of Chopin. And what I want you guys to do, I want you to read the yellow wallpaper. I'm going to create a discussion forum. And I want you to go into the discussion forum after you read the yellow wallpaper. And I want you to write a comparison and contrast with the yellow wallpaper and the two stories we've read by Kate Chopin. What is different about them? What is similar about them? How do you think these two stories are connected? In what way? This is a hard question because you'll notice the genre completely changes for yellow wallpaper. If you're a fan of horror, you're going to like yellow wallpaper. But again, I want you to think about this in the context of Kate Chopin. Why am I connecting these things together? And keep in mind, this is a discussion forum. It's going to mimic what we do in our classroom. Don't be afraid to be wrong, but please be substantial. Write a paragraph or two and tell me why you think I'm pushing you in this direction. Let's exercise those critical thinking skills. Also, if you've not turned in the last paper, the literary analysis review that I highlighted for you, Shame on you. That was due last week. But considering the fact that, I mean, me and Scorch here are trapped in the office because we can't have class, I will forgive you this one time. But it's only because Scorch advocated on behalf for you. So if you haven't turned in that paper yet, I want you to give Scorch a thank you at the end of the paper. If you don't, I will take off points. Because I got to tell you, this guy, he's your hero right now. I wouldn't be accepting it right now if it wasn't for Scorch. So anyway, get those papers in. Tell Scorch. I'm going to go create that discussion forum now. These things always peter out at the end. Like, do you think I need to have like a green screen so I can have like a star field or something behind me, or like we're constantly getting attacked by Godzilla? That'd be pretty cool, right? I wonder if the school would fund something like that. I'm wasting time. Okay, fine, be that way. Sure, whatever.